let's let's talk a little bit about what public choice economics is. This is where Buchanan sort of, I guess, started and realized, like, hey, I'm going to get fundamentally more anti-democratic in some respects, it seems to me. But but start with that. Explain that to us.
Okay, so public choice economics is actually a broader current of political economy, and there are some liberals who see value in public choice ideas. For example, Cass Sunstein, Obama's, he was called the regulatory czar, wrote a book called Nudge, about how you could use knowledge of incentives to shape good public policy. So I do want to make clear that it's not just a project of the right, but Buchanan's particular stream of that larger current of public choice thought was what he and his followers began to call the Virginia School of Political Economy. And in his hands, it was very much a set of ideas to basically bring this Calhoun-like notion that the population divides into makers, the people who are now called job creators too, right? Makers and takers, and that you have to beware of the takers and that they are going to exploit the makers through their political power and the ability of government to transfer to transfer tax revenues from one group to another. So Buchanan thought long and hard about those issues and ended up arguing for what he called a constitutional revolution. He said that no government in the world, no constitution in the world was adequately protective of the rights of the minority. And by the minority, he did not mean, racial minorities. He had never shown concern about them. He meant economic minorities, the wealthy minority. No constitution was adequately protective of their liberty and their minority rights, and so he made his life's mission from the mid-1970s on what he called constitutional economics, figuring out how you could change the rules of governance and ultimately the constitutional rules in order to essentially undercut the model of government that we knew over the course of the 20th century. A government that does things like protects workers' rights, that intervenes to regulate the environment, that has anti-discrimination enforcement, all those kinds of things that, social insurance for older retired people so that they don't go poor in their old age if they don't have savings accounts. All of those kinds of things that most of us think of as a good society, right, and a really, really good use of our government were things that really irritated Buchanan and these other libertarians. And you see that again in what's playing out in this healthcare legislation. One of the Koch people said that the Senate's plan was a slight nip and tuck of Obama's health care law, and he described what they were doing as immoral. That's what they mean by immoral. That seems, inscrutable to most of us, when we're talking about people's lives who might be saved by having access to health care. But for these arch libertarians, it's immoral for the government to tax me as a person of wealth in order to make sure that you, as a person who did not save, does not die.
Well, what's fascinating about this, too, is it seems to me like the advent of constitutions, is fundamentally at odds with his project. At least it was until he figured out some way of manipulating it, right? I mean, the reason why we have constitutions is because we no longer have sort of feudal systems that are dominated by those people who have a corner on whatever the currency is in that era. Maybe it was, steel swords and, chariots,
right,
and the gold to pay for it or whatever it was. But, I mean, that's the dilemma, is that once you have a constitution, once you have a democracy, you are fundamentally running contrary to this guy, and I should say, it seems to me, Charles Koch, and I would say also the Mont Pelerin Society.
Yeah.
I mean, just remind people about that, because it seems to me this is where Buchanan, once he gets sort of read into those group of folks, where he becomes more fundamentally anti-democratic.
Yes, absolutely. All the things you raise are spot on. As far as the Mont Pelerin Society, yes, it was founded in 1947, just as Buchanan was in graduate school, and his mentor was the only American who was among the triumvirate of founders. So it was also Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and this guy named Frank Knight, who was then the most famous member of the Chicago School. Milton Friedman was just, was a young new faculty member who was there as an add-on, but not particularly significant at that point. But anyway, this Mont Pelerin Society is an invitation-only international society, mostly European and American in the beginning, but now worldwide. And it included thinkers like Buchanan, Hayek, Friedman, et cetera, and businessmen, very arch-libertarian businessmen. Charles Koch joined in 1970, for example, and these right-wing foundations that subsidized the whole effort. And so originally it started as a kind of a talk shop, for people who wanted what they called the free society, but which many of us would call free market fundamentalism. But by the end, in the recent years, by the late 1990s, it really had become, it seems, kind of taken over by Charles Koch and like-thinking billionaires. Even some people who had been part of the early effort were complaining about that and retreating from it. And Buchanan and Koch and these others actually discuss some of the things that they're going to be doing at George Mason to advance this audacious project to change our society and government. They discuss that at the Mont Pelerin Society, according to documents I found in Buchanan's papers. So, and also by the late 1970s, the Mont Pelerin people realized that they would be a permanent minority. And again, I have documents that show that. And therefore, they start talking about, well, how do we get, we may have to get non-democratic governments in order to achieve what it is that we want. And they're very explicit about that. And actually, Buchanan helps get such a constitution in Chile, and I have a chapter on that. But in terms of your point about the constitutions, another thing I think is really interesting here is that, this whole apparatus, and by now the Koch money and the influence is it's not just in his personal project, the Cato Institute, from the 1970s. It's the Heritage Foundation. It's, it's just like, I could name 15 right off the tip of my tongue, but I won't take up the time. But it's throughout this apparatus. And what's really interesting is they present themselves as Madisonians, right? They say, oh, we're the people who are supporting the founders' vision, and, we just want to prevent these people who have hijacked our government and, destroyed our liberty and blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, the vision of government they're advocating is Calhounian, and Madison himself said it would be the end of free government everywhere. If this, I forget the exact quote, but it's in the book. Madison said that, this would be the end of the American experiment of we the people if ideas like Calhoun's were allowed to prevail, that it was based on such a radical misinterpretation and rerouting of the constitutional project in America. And I think that's interesting, too, because, a lot of your readers will know, the U.S. Constitution is a pretty conservative document, right? And Madison was very concerned with protecting property rights. So our Constitution, as it is, protects property rights to a degree that no other constitution in the world does. It has 4 veto points, which is unparalleled for modern constitutional democracies. And yet these guys are saying it doesn't have enough protections of their interest, as the rest of us are saying, what are we going to do about the skyrocketing inequality in our society and the unresponsiveness of our system given current interpretations of the Constitution?
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos